Hi, Todd Dunn here for Life on the Edge. This is the 6th video in my chronic lymphocytic leukemia series. I'm going to change gears a little bit this time, and instead of talking about the disease in an abstract scientific fashion, I'm going to talk about one patient's experience with chronic lymphocytic leukemia from diagnosis to the present. I know that patient pretty well because it's me. So what I'm doing today is giving you my chronic lymphocytic leukemia story. At this point, I'm about 13 and a half months into the disease since diagnosis. So let's go. How did it all start? In February of 2016, I had a really bad night with some severe pain on the left side of my chest that radiated up into my left arm and had me wondering if I wasn't having some sort of heart event. So I did what any rational, web-savvy person would do. I Googled my symptoms and got some possibilities. Basically, the details of what I was feeling didn't really fit with a heart attack, which is what I initially thought might be going on. Particularly inasmuch as soon as I sat up from where I had been lying in bed, the pain diminished quite dramatically, and after a little while it went away. So I laid down again, came right back. In the end, I'm pretty sure that what I had was really bad gas that compressed my spleen and caused some significant pain. But we won't really ever know that. Nevertheless, the next day, having survived the event, I went to the doctor, described my symptoms, and they promptly ran me through an initial heart attack evaluation to find out if I had a heart attack. I had blood drawn for tests. I had an EKG. The doctor spent a lot of time listening to my heart. And they also did a chest x-ray to look at things in there. So I went home after this fairly reassured about my heart because the EKG didn't show anything unusual. It was a completely normal result, but I had to wait. The next day I got a call from my doctor who said all the blood tests looked fine and there was no evidence at all that I had had any kind of heart event, so that was positive. But, and this is where things got a little funny, my doctor said, I have never seen anyone with as high a white blood cell count as you have. Well, that was a little bit concerning. I asked, what did it mean? My doctor said, well, I've consulted the on-call hematologist for the area, and they want to get more blood work before we say anything. For two reasons. We want to confirm that your white count really is as high as it came out in the tests, and we want to get another test to evaluate it to see if what might be wrong. So I went back to the doctor's office the next day, had more blood drawn. Some of the blood went for a CBC, a complete blood count, my second in 2 days. And some of the blood went off to the local laboratory where it could have a test called flow cytometry done on it. At the time, I knew nothing about flow cytometry. I didn't know what the test was done for or what it would tell them. And they didn't really tell me what the test was. They just said an additional, more specific blood test. Well, nothing happened for about 6 days. And then one afternoon, on my 64th birthday, my phone rang. It was the local hematologist-oncologist's office. His nurse was on the phone and told me that The results of my flow cytometry test and my other CBC test were back, and that I had chronic lymphocytic leukemia. Well, this was a bit of a stunner. I pretty much only heard leukemia and, wasn't very exactly happy about that. But the nurse went on to reassure me that the operative word was chronic, that nothing was going to happen quickly, although in the day between my two blood tests, my white cell count had jumped from about 53,000 to just over 70,000, which was a big jump for 24 hours. And she didn't have an explanation for that, she just told me about it. And then set me up for an appointment a week later with the hematologist-oncologist. So I had a pretty bad week. Here I was, a week later, before I had felt fine, except for really bad gas, and basically didn't think anything was wrong with me. Felt perfectly healthy. And now suddenly I have leukemia. So naturally I went back to the internet and I looked up chronic lymphocytic leukemia, which I had never heard of prior to that phone call, and read everything I could find about it. Well, naturally, as a sort of human nature, what stuck with me as I read about chronic lymphocytic leukemia were all the negatives. The more less negative aspects of the disease didn't really stick with me. I read about cytogenetics, about 17p deletions, about lymphocyte doubling times, time to treatment from first diagnosis as a function of your cytogenetics, etc. And everything that I read pointed to, hey, I might be going into some sort of chemotherapy soon, like maybe within a couple of weeks. I didn't know. So I did some, stupid responses perhaps. Because of the stress of it, I started my Social Security a couple years before I had planned to, because I at least was thinking to myself that, I could be dead in 2 years. Maybe I ought to get something out of Social Security now while I still have a chance. So I started that, and I made a few other changes in my life. That week went by very slowly before my first appointment with the hematologist-oncologist. The day of my appointment, I went in for more blood tests. This now is about 2 weeks after my first blood test that showed up a high white blood cell count. I went in for more blood tests, and that afternoon I saw the doctor, who came in, introduced himself, the usual things, and proceeded to give me a quick physical exam, mostly looking for lymph node enlargement. He found a couple of very slightly enlarged lymph nodes under my left arm, which I couldn't feel. He said they were just barely detectable, but because of the rapidly increasing blood count, which by this time had jumped to 90,000, so that's an increase of 80% in 2 weeks, he was concerned that I might have a rapidly progressing variant of CLL. So he scheduled me for yet more blood tests and also some CAT scans to look for enlarged lymph nodes in my torso and hips, to see if, and also to evaluate whether or not my spleen was enlarged. I left that meeting with the doctor with a diagnosis of RI stage 1 chronic lymphocytic leukemia, which, because of my reading, I knew what that meant, that that's low risk and probably relatively slow progression, but my apparently rapidly increasing white cell count argued against that. So I didn't know what was going on, and I had a week until my CAT scans and my next blood test, which would include a fish test, which I talked about in my last video. And unfortunately, because my doctor was going away for a vacation, I wouldn't be able to see him for 4 weeks. So between my first visit and my second visit, where I would get all the diagnostic results back, prognostic results, I had 4 weeks to wait. And boy, that was a stressful period. Everything I read suggested that I had, and my blood work suggested that I had rapidly progressing CLL. And I was very concerned that I would be going into treatment, possibly chemoimmunotherapy, within a couple of weeks after I saw the doctor the next time. I just didn't know. I went through and took my blood work and did regression fits of my blood work to exponential functions and calculated the doubling time, and then used that to project my blood counts to the date of my next blood test 4 weeks later, and had numbers written down for what my blood count would be if the rate of progression continued. And they were pretty scary numbers. I mean, I was looking at going from 90,000 to over 200,000 if the progression continued at the rate that it was apparently at, and which would certainly trigger treatment. So it was a terrible month, really stressful. Everything I read left me with a negative feeling as I found out more and more about CLL and the negative consequences of it. And pretty much largely because of my apparently rapidly increasing white count, everything that I read, only the negative stuck with me. So I was really apprehensive when I went in. I got my round of blood tests a week later, 9 or 10 vials of blood, something like that. And then I had my CAT scans and came out of the hospital after receiving a bill for the 45 minutes I was there for $4,600, which was coming out of my pocket since I hadn't met my insurance deductible yet for the year. So in addition to the stress of knowing that I had CLL and being worried that maybe it was really bad, I was also suffering from a significant cash extraction from my wallet, which is equally painful in its own way. So finally, I came back a month later, went in the morning, more blood tests to get my current situation, and then in the afternoon, met with the doctor. Well, I knew things were looking pretty good when he came in, because he was smiling and looked very cheerful. He started out by saying, well, your blood work is back down to 50,000 absolute lymphocyte count. It's actually a little bit lower than it was from your initial blood test a month and a half ago. So, boy, that was positive. And then he told me that my FISH result was 13Q with only 17% of the cells having the deletion, which was even more positive. I had prepared for this doctor's visit with a list of questions for every possible FISH result. And basically, I was so euphoric over what he told me that I completely forgot to ask him the questions. So I just moved on. I went home feeling great. I apparently, although I had CLL, it was stable. I had the best possible cytogenetics, the best possible prognosis. Everything looked good. And my doctor put me on a cycle of blood testing of about 3 months at the end of June. Between my end of March appointment and my end of June appointment, I did have some additional medical work done, not directly connected to the CLL, but my doctor wanted me to be evaluated for other cancers, including an apparent skin cancer on my cheek and also for colon cancer possibility, a colonoscopy, and they also wanted me to get a full heart workup in the hospital by a cardiologist to see if I did have a heart condition, just to rule it out completely. Well, I went to the dermatologist. Turned out I had a basal cell carcinoma. I got scheduled for Mohs surgery to remove it. That wouldn't happen until the beginning of August. I had the colonoscopy. They found a couple of small non-cancerous polyps which were removed, and everything was fine. And the heart workup came back wonderful. The cardiologist said that my heart was effectively the heart of a 30-year-old, which I felt pretty good about since I was 64 at the time. So everything was looking pretty good. I came in at the end of June to the oncologist. I have to say that I was feeling pretty positive up until the last week before my oncologist's visit, because at that point I started worrying what the results would be. Would they be bad or would they be good? The uncertainty led to stress. So I went in, another round of blood tests, went into the doctor. Everything was stable. He didn't have anything to say other than, okay, I'm going to be gone in September, so why don't I see you at the end of August? So everything was set. I would come back at the end of August. And I left feeling pretty positive about things. The disease was stable, it wasn't progressing, and I felt good. In the interim, I had my Mohs surgery where they lopped a 1¼ inch diameter chunk of skin out of my left cheek, and I left with that surgery with a scar starting up here and going all the way down here. But it's healed up reasonably well. If you look closely, you can still see it. But I have to say, Mohs surgery was completely painless, except for the initial needle sticks when they injected me with anesthetic. And all in all, not at all a bad experience, despite the fact that they lopped a big chunk off my face. Anyway, at the end of August, I came back, more blood tests, saw the doctor. He wasn't smiling when he came in. It seems that from the end of June to the end of August, my platelets had taken a nosedive. They'd gone from the normal, sort of low normal, to 85,000. Well, hematologists start getting worried about platelet counts when they go below 100,000. In addition, in CLL staging, a situation where you have slightly enlarged lymph nodes, maybe a slightly enlarged spleen, which I do have, that showed up in my CAT scan results, and platelet count below 100,000, technically that's stage 4 chronic lymphocytic leukemia, which in itself is justification for treatment in the treatment algorithms. So, wow. The next thing he said after he told me my platelets had dived was that he was going to talk to me about treatment. Wow, that was a big downer. But he then said, well, but not right away, because the treatment would not be for your CLL, it would be for the platelets, to try and raise your platelet count. He said, but we're not going to do that unless your platelet count drops below 50,000. And if it does drop below 50,000, you'll go in for a bone marrow biopsy to determine that it is indeed autoimmune thrombocytopenia and not caused by lack of platelet production in the bone marrow due to lymphocyte infiltration into the bone marrow. So I left that meeting, which I had gone into thinking, well, everything's been stable. Maybe the doctor will switch me to a 6-month cycle of blood tests and appointments, and that would be great. I left that meeting on a 1-month cycle of blood tests with appointments every 2 months. Quite a change. I was really down. I responded by reading everything I could about immune thrombocytopenia and really building up my knowledge about another disease that I'd never heard of. Anyway, I went in at the end of September for another blood test, and everything came out pretty much stable. My platelets were still low. They had rebounded a little bit, but my neutrophils were down. They had dropped down to 1.2, which is into the range of stage 1 neutropenia, which isn't, at that level, it isn't really a risk, but it's enough to start thinking about it. But my platelets were stable, and my white cell count was stable. So, just continued. But I was now in this 1-month cycle of blood tests, which meant for about 3 weeks I lived a more or less normal life. And then a week before the blood test, as the stress built up and the uncertainty built up of what would the blood test show, I started feeling pretty bad about things. So I would go through 3 weeks, okay, and then 1 week of increasing stress, have the blood test, and then wait for the doctor's office to call me to tell me the results. This cycle was repeated at the end of October. The doctor canceled the appointment that he had initially scheduled for me, so I had just another blood test, another wait. Results came out pretty much the same. My platelets had moved a little, but they were really within analytical uncertainty of where they'd been before. My neutrophils were down a little bit more, but still not anything to worry about. And my white count was stable. End of November, everything came back the same, except my neutrophils had dropped down to 1, or 1,000 cells per microliter. That is the top of the range where people start to worry about low neutrophils. If they go below 1, then you start worrying about it. You start taking precautions to avoid getting exposed to diseases of various kinds. So that was where I was at the end of November. Still stable, still waiting for another month. My next appointment and the next round of blood tests was right after Christmas, which made for a pretty stressful Christmas as I waited for my blood work to get done. And my next appointment turned out that my doctor was on vacation again, so I had an appointment with a new doctor that I had never seen before, which actually was a positive because in effect I got a second opinion. So I had my blood work done at the end of December, went in, saw the new doctor who looked everything over. Everything was stable. My platelets had rebounded a little bit up to 1.2. Or not platelets, my neutrophils had rebounded a little. My platelets were pretty much right where they had been, and my white count was stable. The new doctor examined me, and in response to my questions said, yeah, you're stage 1 chronic lymphocytic leukemia. And I said, well, what? Given my platelets are below 100,000, doesn't that technically make me stage 4? And he said, well, you're not anemic, and realistically, if the CLL was directly causing the low platelets through inhibiting platelet production in the bone marrow, you would expect to be anemic too. So basically, he thought that I had stable disease, that nothing really was changing, and that they could drop me to a 5-month hiatus between appointments, which sounded pretty good to me. But I stayed on the 1-month cycle of blood tests. For insurance reasons, I didn't have any blood work done at the end of January. We waited until the beginning of February, and then got my next round of blood tests. The results, normally I got them back. I got a call from the doctor's office within a couple of hours of getting the blood work done. Well, they didn't call me. They didn't call me until the next day. So I was pretty worried. wow, did they have to have a consultation? Were they going to schedule me for a bone marrow biopsy? I didn't know. It was really a tough day to go through. Well, finally, the call came the next day. And it was nothing to worry about. The nurse simply forgot to call me. It happens. She was apologetic, and that was that. So I went back into my 3 weeks of feeling okay, followed by a week of building stress. And at the beginning of March, I had another blood test. Everything was the same, except that my neutrophils had rebounded back up into the normal range. They more than doubled, which was great news. Platelets unchanged. White cell count up a little bit, but within normal fluctuations. So I got my phone call from the doctor's office, and they said, well, we're going to put you on a 2-month cycle of blood tests because you're stable. So I don't have to go back until the beginning of May, which is wonderful. And I have a doctor's appointment at the end of May. So that's where I am right now. Things are stable. I have a high white cell count. I do have low platelets, but they haven't really changed in 6 months. So, we don't expect them to change suddenly. So now I get 7 weeks where I can feel pretty normal about my life, and then only 1 week of increasing stress and worry. So I continue, I'm watch and wait, 13 and a half months into my CLL, and we'll just have to wait and see what happens. But I've gotten pretty much used to the disease at this point, and the monthly stress of the blood test, or bi-monthly stress of the blood test now, has actually decreased, and I'm feeling a lot less concerned. And I hope that that continues for a long time. Anyway, that's my CLL story. I hope it's been informative to people to know what they might expect and some of the stresses involved. If you liked hearing about my story, click like. If you want to hear about my next videos in this series, subscribe and you'll get a notification. Thank you very much.